Okay, thank you so much, everybody. So I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Michael Zimmer as our next speaker. Dr. Zimmer is the director of the Center for Data, Ethics, and Society at Marquette University and is a professor in the Department of Computer Science. Dr. Zimmer is a privacy and data ethics scholar who uses mixed methods to understand the social and ethical dimensions of our contemporary digital ecosystem. His work focuses on digital privacy and surveillance, the ethics of big data, internet research ethics, and the broader social and ethical dimensions of emerging digital technologies. Dr. Zimmer currently co-chairs the AOIR Ethics Working Group, serves on the SIGCHI Research Ethics Committee, and sits on numerous other advisory and editorial boards. He was recently named the Ethics Advisor for the European Commission-sponsored Spatial Project, standing for Security and Privacy Accountable Technology Innovations, Algorithms, and Machine Learning. Please welcome me and joining Dr. Zimmer to the stage.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to be able to be here and share some of the work that we're doing in the Center for Data Ethics and Society at Marquette University, just across the lake over in Milwaukee. And some of the work I'm doing across a couple other broader collaborations and research communities engaging with some of the emerging challenges of research ethics as it relates to new technologies being used across research protocols. I think there's a lot for us to cover. I have a short amount of time. I could spend all day taking questions and trying to address some of the issues that I suspect many of you are seeing in various research protocols coming across your committees. But I want to try to highlight a little bit about kind of what does this research look like? What is it about big data and artificial intelligence, machine learning that's suddenly creating some new challenges for us when we're thinking about research ethics? I'm going to talk about some conceptual gaps that I see emerging on how we're dealing with questions around privacy or around consent, and especially focusing on the question of harm and how we're sort of framing the idea of harm and what it is, again, when we're seeing research protocols with some unique forms of data, how that might be pushing us to have to rethink the way that we conceptualize some of these core issues that we're using when we're making judgments around the ethics of these different research type studies. I have a few suggestions on where we're going next in the space, including some of the work that my teams are doing and some of the research communities that I'm a part of. And I'll be interested in hearing with some questions and feedback in terms of what you're seeing on possible ways for us to sort of start addressing some of these broader issues. When I think about things like big data and large data sets, when I'm teaching classes on data ethics, I often start with this essay from Wired magazine. It's 15 years old already now, written by Chris Anderson, who was the editor of Wired. And he wrote this very provocative essay talking about the end of theory. Subtitled, "The Data Deluge Makes the Scientific Method Obsolete." This was coming out in 2008 when we're starting to really embrace big data as a new paradigm for us to be thinking about the world. This idea that we suddenly have these enormous data sets, not just data sets that people have had for a long time, like in working in fields of like astrophysics or other kinds of places where we have huge amounts of data, but large data sets about people. Large data sets about human behaviors, about transactions, about communication. And Anderson wrote this essay making this provocative stance that because of big data, we no longer need to bother with hypotheses and small sample sizes and running little experiments and our friends in the social sciences do because we have all the data. He was proposing this new epistemology, this new way of understanding the world through big data, and he's writing throughout this, and I have the quote highlighted here, that no one knows why people do what they do. The point is that they do it, and now we can track and measure it with unprecedented fidelity. Truth will just emerge from data. There's lots to like unpack and critique about this argument, but it's a real nice way of thinking about how the world started to embrace big data as a new way to just understand phenomenon. I don't need to run a sample of 300 people and ask them some survey questions and hope that gives me an understanding of human behavior, because now I can just study big data sets and truth will just emerge. So this became sort of this foundation of many new sort of forms of engaging in science and social science especially, computational social science emerging as a space where we suddenly have access to large data sets of people's behaviors, of their communications, of their transactions, of their interactions, data sets about people's movements, their health, their well-being, their mood. And this became the new sort of place for us to find truth and engage in some really interesting research. And I'm sure many of you have seen these kinds of data sets suddenly coming from departments like computer science or economics or behavioral psychology, where they're leveraging large data. It's not just running a survey or an experiment, but now I have access to data from different kind of platforms in order to engage in this kind of science. This is giving us a new way to understand the world. This is sort of this new dimension that's emerging when we start thinking about how do we make sense of what's going on around us. Big data has really become a primary source for this kind of understanding. But we also now have artificial intelligence. Most of the times when we talk about artificial intelligence, what we really mean are forms of machine learning. And I don't want to turn this into a seminar of everything that's wrong with ChatGPT, but it's important for us to recognize that artificial intelligence is a dream that does not exist yet. We have really good systems of finding patterns. We have access to large amounts of data. We have really good applied statistics, really good processing power, and people trying to throw some really interesting questions at this data. That's what we're doing. We're building systems. It's very complicated. It's very impressive. But I have some colleagues who just say, whenever you see the phrase artificial intelligence, replace it with mathy maths. It's just really good math and statistics. You know, I'm not belittling the skill that's involved, but we don't have supercomputers that are thinking on their own. We have really good statistical models. These are using advanced algorithms. I'm sure many of you are starting to see protocols that are taking data sets. How do I train an algorithm to identify X? How do I train a system to try to improve the way that we make decisions about something? And we're taking huge amounts of data, extremely powerful processors, and applying machine learning techniques. It's really good, it's really interesting. It's why we have generative systems like ChatGPT, or if you've played around with some of the image generating systems, there's one called DALL-E, there's Midjourney, there's all kinds of different ones out there. My kids are playing on them. They're really good and really impressive at creating things that look like they're human-made, but they're running statistics, they're running probabilities. ChatGPT has read a whole lot of language, has processed a whole lot of language, a whole lot of text, and it knows how to predict what the next probable word is in any given sentence. And it's getting really good at that, so it creates whole paragraphs that appear to be human-made and look like a human speech. These are the kinds of systems that increasingly are showing up in our research protocols as well, using large data sets for their training, being applied to really unique and challenging contexts as well, creating all kinds of new opportunities for research to really blossom. So some great advances that we're seeing across these many different platforms. So we're seeing more and more AI and machine learning being used in not just computational spaces like my computer science colleagues, but across different disciplines. How do we leverage AI? How do we leverage machine learning to do better medical image processing, to do natural language processing, to help me understand what people are saying on a platform like Reddit, to help me train a face recognition system to help law enforcement do their job more effectively. We see this across dozens of contexts. We're seeing data being collected from numerous sources. And this is a space that I spend a lot of time working in, and how people are using data from Twitter, data from forums like Reddit, images from platforms like Instagram or YouTube, or Flickr, for those of us that are old enough to have Flickr accounts or even know what that is, which was really unique at the time, of course. But large data sets that are generally publicly available, are being used in lots of interesting and novel ways. So I spent a lot of time thinking about different examples of these. And research using these kinds of data sets go back a long time. I could spend an hour talking about all these examples. Some of these might be familiar to you. These are some older examples that I've looked at in terms of how people are using data that we might describe as publicly available data, social data, big data about people, to try to answer some interesting social science, computational science, or other kinds of questions. So search query databases, Facebook data, collecting data from people's BlackBerries, trying to understand how kids interact in the schoolyards. So let's capture their text messaging traffic. There are more examples. People using dating websites as a source of data to try to understand people's personalities and preferences. Using different sources of faces to train algorithms to make some kind of prediction about people. Using students and the students our cards have to get around campus, to swipe into buildings, to make transactions, to pay for their lunch, to understand student sociability. Where are students going? Who are they sitting with? How often do they go to the library versus the gym versus using a vending machine at 3 in the morning? Interesting data that you could use to help understand student behavior. And then some more recent examples of using faces, using images from Instagram, videos that people share on YouTube, large face databases, other databases I've seen of people walking across campus to help improve algorithms that do what's called gait analysis, identifying people based on how they walk. So large data sets. Data readily available for researchers to grab examples of, to go train an algorithm, to build a system. If you've had a chance to scan through the little blurbs that I've provided here, you see that a lot of these are really unique uses of big data. Some really interesting examples of where I could find some data quite easily and quite cheaply in order to solve perhaps a hard problem. But each of these has some really interesting ethical dimensions. Some of these created headlines in terms of some of the controversies on how people were collecting and using data. Some of those studies, the data's been actually, I guess, pulled back, removed from being publicly available. This is the challenge that we have. This is the challenge that I see a lot in the work that we're doing on how do we help researchers do this kind of research, answer these kinds of questions, take advantage of some of the data that they have available, but still deal with these really thorny ethical questions about what it means to these data subjects, where the data might be collected from. How does this impact them? What are the ways that we can engage these kinds of things in an ethically informed way? So I see 3 key issues that are at play here when we start talking about the use of this kind of big data in research protocols. One has to do with the nature of the data itself. We'll talk about that a little bit. We have these conceptual gaps. And then really, again, this question about how do we frame the issue of harm. Has anybody here know Python? I hope I don't, even though I teach in computer science. A handful of people. So there will be a room full of students across campus, and they all are learning Python. My kids are starting to learn Python in grade school. They're learning how to write code. They're learning how to write code in ways that makes it easy to go onto websites and grab data. This is one of the key challenges and key differences in the rise of big data sets in research. We're no longer in those days where if I wanted to study a population, I had to have a large NIH grant and a ton of money and a big lab, a whole bunch of training and reputational things at stake to go collect my data. I could ask a student to go get me 10,000 Instagram photos and they'll have it for me by the end of class. You know, it's become incredibly easy to write a little bit of code to go grab data that's available online. That doesn't mean that they're hacking something. It doesn't mean they're doing something necessarily illegal. The data's out there. You can go and grab it if you wanted to do a study, if you wanted to play around in class on a class project, do an exercise, or engage in a large-scale research project. It's just that easy now to get this kind of data. There are websites dedicated to collecting and sharing large data sets. On the platform Reddit, there's a subreddit called /datasets, where the whole point is, I'm looking for a data set of all the tweets about COVID-19 in Ann Arbor from this date to that date, and that someone will help you find and create that data set. There are web platforms, Kaggle's one of them, that just collects data sets. And you can really search just about anything and you will find a data set available for you. If you're teaching a data analytics course, these things are gold. Because you want your students to go find a data set, to go figure things out, work on cleaning the data, work on all kinds of, what can they learn from this data. But it's just become really easy for us to get our hands on large data sets that might include information that could be sensitive, that could be surprising for people to realize that their data is sitting out there in these kinds of data sets. The other challenge is that this data is more than just big data. My colleagues and I call this pervasive data. This is data that's about people. It's data that's about aspects of your lives that you may not realize are being collected. We've done research on Fitbit users, and you'd be surprised how many people don't have a full understanding of the large amount of data that a wearable device is able to collect from you. Or that you don't even have to own a wearable device, and your iPhone is collecting a lot of information about how many stairs you climb, the average length of how rapidly you walk, the length of your gait, all just from the accelerometer in your phone in your pocket. We have interesting challenges about how data is crossing different dimensions. Where we used to have the nice simple research protocols where I was collecting data through a survey and it was contained in this nice little safe space that I could consent and fully understand. But now I have data coming from multiple devices, multiple sources, multiple platforms, but easily combinable. Or when you realize or start talking to your students about how a company, for example, Google, has access to things that you might be doing on the Google platform and the YouTube platform. And they also own Fitbit now. They also manage primarily the Android platform and can track where we're going with Android phones, have location data. There's a large sphere suddenly across different contexts of our lives that might be available through one single platform. And I'm not trying to raise red flags and conspiracies, but it's just the fact that we have different parts of our lives that used to be easily sort of kept separate and kept protected are increasingly intermingled. And that can create a challenge for us when we're thinking about how people understand how their data might be used. So the rise of these technologies, the rise of these new platforms, the rise of the ease of collecting this kind of data creates conceptual gaps. And I like to refer back to Jim Moore, who is one of the founders of the field of computer ethics. And back in the 80s, when we had all these fancy new digital computers emerging and this digital network, the internet emerging, he was recognizing that when we have these new technologies entering our lives in such meaningful ways, suddenly the laws, the policies, the ethical frameworks that we thought were pretty settled and we had pretty well figured out, we suddenly have gaps. We have vacuums in place. Think about how, again, if you remember Napster, suddenly we thought we had copyright pretty well figured out, for most of the century. And then suddenly this new digital sharing platform emerges and our laws and our concepts and our ethics around sharing content were suddenly thrown just into chaos. We had this gap that emerged. So it's a lot of what we spend time thinking about. When we introduce a new technology or a new platform into a setting, what are some of the gaps that emerge and how we think about concepts that we thought were pretty well settled? And I think we can think about these gaps when it comes down to issues of privacy and consent. But it comes down to issues of human subjects and the nature of harm. So I suspect everyone here really has a good understanding of how privacy has become challenged over recent decades with the rise of different kinds of technologies. Too often we see the assumptions being made that, there's no more privacy, just get over it. If you didn't want something to be known, then you shouldn't have put it online. Since I posted something on Facebook, I shouldn't have any expectation of privacy anymore over that data. And I think these are positions that are missing the deeper truth around privacy. And privacy is very contextual. Privacy is really can no longer be thought of as that dichotomy between public and private information. Too often privacy is framed, this is a problem with my computer science colleagues, as about security, about keeping secrets. And as long as something is secure, therefore we have privacy. Or if something is no longer a secret, then you should no longer have an expectation of privacy about that. So many of you here work for the University of Michigan. That means your salary is probably publicly available in some database because the taxpayers in Michigan have a right to know where their taxpayer money is going. But I suspect if I ask you right now to stand up and tell me your salary, you might hesitate to do that. It's not a secret per se, but it's information you want to control. This isn't the right context to be talking and sharing about salaries. Maybe in a private conversation, we can have that discussion, but not here among this group. There's a context and there's norms that govern what's the appropriate flow of information within that context. That's what contextual integrity, a theory that Helen Nissenbaum has proposed around privacy, is built around. That privacy is not a dichotomy. Just because I share something over here doesn't mean anything goes. That there are contexts that should govern how and when information flows and what's appropriate in those kinds of ways. I want us to think about privacy in just that kind of way. When we start thinking about whether or not data is on a public forum or whether or not data was shared with the researcher in this context, doesn't automatically mean that there's no longer a privacy expectation at play. We need to have a deeper level of engagement with what that user, that subject might be thinking about. And that relates to this question of consent as well. And we see many, many cases where because data was collected in a public website, that we say we no longer need to engage in specific consent of that data. And that probably works most of the time. I just fear that we make that a blanket rule, and that's what can cause some challenges for us. I remember, so I'm part of the Association of Internet Researchers, and we have ethics guidelines that I hope you're familiar with, or at least that your researchers that are using internet-based data might be familiar with. The first version of our guidelines had that kind of statement. If it's a public forum, if you don't need a password to get to the data, then it's okay to use it. And we wrote those guidelines, that first version, in 2002. We've grown conceptually how we think about this, that's not enough. We need to have a deeper look into what we mean by consent. We need to understand that sometimes users don't understand how public their information might be. My colleagues, Casey Fiesler and Nick Preferis, have written a paper studying Twitter users, where they asked users about their awareness that there's what's called a researcher API, an application programming interface, a way that researchers can go to Twitter, or used to be able to go to Twitter, and say, I would like to get tweets about COVID-19 in this geographic location, on these dates, and the system would give them a data dump that has all that information on it. When most users think about Twitter, or when they used to think about Twitter, it was this little website and this stream of tweets, and these tweets would disappear, and the word tweet makes it sound like it's just a little thing that goes away. And they didn't have a good mental model that there was an archive, and that researchers could go and capture historical data about what you tweet. So there's many examples of this where users may not understand how publicly available something is. The terms of service might change. The nature of a platform and their architecture and their rules and policies might change in terms of what's public or what's restricted or what's not. These are all things that we need to think about when we think about consent. The nature of this digital environment has changed sort of what we had kind of settled as a way of thinking about issues of consent. The same with human subjects. Again, this is something where so much of my work now is working in the space of computer science and computational sciences, where my colleagues aren't used to thinking about human subjects. I don't know if my computer science faculty colleagues have gone through any city training or anything, because it's not part of their universe. It was never part of their training when they grew up as scholars, that they're dealing with humans in their research. I'm studying networks, I'm studying data, I'm studying systems. And this is a conceptual gap that I think we're working towards closing. That we need to broaden what we think of as a human subject. We need to recognize that this distance principle which was a concept that was often used to say that I'm so far away from that human that I really don't need to go through the IRB process because there's this distance between me and them. And that just doesn't apply in so many of these kinds of protocols. We're also starting to see a greater focus on subjects beyond just the individual that you might be collecting data from. And we need to think about broader communities. And I have an example we could talk about in that as well. So I'm throwing a lot of concepts out there. I'm going quickly through all these. These are high-level kinds of issues, and each one of these we could have a whole discussion around. But harm is one that I do think is a really interesting challenge for us. On how do we frame and how do we think about harm? This goes back to the work I've done for many years around privacy, where we often compare the way US deals with privacy versus like the European Union, where the European Union has a broader conception around privacy as something that is about protecting one's dignity, protecting one's autonomy. And in the US, we regulate privacy only when we see specific harms that have taken place, which is why we have privacy laws about health records, student records, your video rental records. If you remember Justice Bork's nomination, those of us, there's a privacy law here about that your video rental records are private, but nothing about your social media records. We have a very specific sectoral approach, and I think we need to take a lesson from the European model where we're thinking about the whole person. We're thinking about this more about dignity and autonomy and not just about specific harms that could happen. We need to think beyond tangible harms like financial risk, reputational harm, physical harm, which are certainly important, but also understand that there could be a broader umbrella of issues that we need to be thinking about when we're saying we're trying to protect someone from harm. And one way to think through this is to change our language and think about wrongs as opposed to harms. And I'm starting to see a few more ethicists engage in this as well and trying to push this out. That if we think about wrongs, how could a person just be wronged? It doesn't mean that there was some tangible specific harm that I can point to. This is why it's hard to get on like CNN and talk about privacy and ethics, because they need that specific thing, you know, that could be argued about. They don't want to have this big talk about human dignity and things like that. But that's where I think we need to land. I think we need to think more about harm in a broader sense. Now, this all gets really hard. I know many of us, we're just trying to apply a set of rules. We're just trying to get things through our queue. But these are the challenges that I'm seeing as we're thinking about how to engage with new technologies in spaces dealing with big data, digital data, the rise of AI and machine learning. My colleague Katie Shilton at University of Maryland has been writing about this as well. She's been noticing that even amongst our research community, we have a lot of disagreement about how to deal with these issues. How do we identify these ethical challenges and how do we try to resolve them? So a few years ago, she and I and a couple of other colleagues got together and were lucky to get a large grant from the NSF to study this problem. And we were excited because this was a directive of the NSF that's usually funding researchers to go collect data and do big things. And they funded a bunch of us, ethicists, social scientists, other kinds of scholars, to sort of step back and try to measure how are researchers thinking about ethics? How are they collecting data? How are they dealing with these issues? How are IRBs thinking about these challenges? How do the platforms engage with researchers around these issues? And how do users themselves understand this kind of work? So we were able to put together a whole bunch of different studies and start trying to do like this, we kind of call it like an environmental scan. Like what is going on in this space? How do people understand these issues and how do we deal with it? We were hoping to write, a whole new Belmont report for big data. We have these big plans of what we're gonna do. Despite the fact that COVID happened during our grant, we suddenly realized this is a grant just to figure out what the heck's going on out there. And now we need the next grant to go try to come up with these recommendations. But we did put out what we call like our manifesto last year. And one of the key things that we took from all of our discussions and conversations and surveys and interviews and engagements across these communities is that there are issues around power, essentially. And again, this is one of these challenges because when we're working with our colleagues in computational and computer sciences, they're increasingly using this kind of pervasive data. This is not a conversation they're used to having. They're not used to thinking about researcher reflexivity or power in their work. We found inspiration from our friends in anthropology who have had a long history of engaging with subjects, of a long history of some problems on how they engage with subjects and communities, but have dealt with this over the decades and have built a framework around researcher reflexivity, awareness, and power. And so we tried to develop some frameworks for computational researchers, for data scientists, computer scientists, and other people playing around with hard data in this way to also think about their positionality when it comes to research subjects. We've built a little bit of a decision tool. I wasn't able to get it into the slide deck, but we're starting to play around with what kind of a tool could we give these researchers to help think about these issues. And I have two examples I want to share before we kind of wrap up and I can answer some questions about some recent work that I'm doing where we're seeing some good examples of researchers engaging in this kind of critical reflection and reflexivity. So again, trying to get these researchers to not just go through the helpful flow chart in terms of whether or not this study is exempt, but engage in this kind of understanding of their position as researchers and what is their relationship to their data subjects. So one example has to do with Reddit, and a team and I have studied about 700 different papers that use Reddit as their source of data. So for those not familiar, Reddit's an online forum. There are thousands upon thousands of sub-communities on Reddit. They're called subreddits. You can pick any topic, boring and exciting, normal and obscure and obscene, and there will be a community on Reddit for that topic. And people engage in discussions and they share ideas and they argue and they make friends and all the things that happen online happen there. It's a great place if you want to study strange communities. A great place if you want to study political debate or argumentation. A great place if you wanted to find people who are struggling with things like depression or experiences of sexual violence or all kinds of topics that could be quite sensitive. We were curious about how these researchers are using Reddit to do these kinds of studies. And we found that most did not mention going to an IRB or anything. Some was mentioned, about 10% mentioned that their IRB, that this study was determined as exempt because the data is public on Reddit. You could go to Reddit and find all this information there. But a small portion made the extra comment in their paper, something to the effect of, despite our IRB, or not despite, but our IRB indicated this was exempt, but given the sensitivity of this topic, or given the vulnerability of this community, we decided to do X, Y, and Z to properly make sure that they were protected. It was great examples of researchers taking that step to be reflexive, to pause, think about. They added some friction to their process, and thankfully they included it in their paper to point out that they took this extra step to try to protect their research community. So we're trying to build from those examples to build some best practices for people using Reddit for research. It's a really nice example of this. Another example is a very specific case with some researchers at Harvard Medical and Partners Health out in Boston who are building algorithms, predictive models to try to reduce suicides. They have a large data set of electronic health records of known people who have attempted suicide, and they're mining that data using natural language processing. What can we learn from these medical files that we could use as predictive measures? So the next time someone comes to a health provider, maybe we have a system in place that might look at their data and be able to create a predictor that this person might be at risk and perhaps an intervention could take place. Really important problem, really good work. They went to the NIMH. They suggested you could make this model even better if you add more data. Not just the EHR data, but add social data. Add data about other factors in people's lives that might have a high predictive value. Things like bankruptcies, financial situations. Things like a lot of disruption in their home life, in their work, changes of address, interactions with law enforcement. A lot of this information is publicly available through data brokers. Whether or not you have a gun in your home or you have a licensed firearm, bankruptcies are public, changes of address tend to be public, law enforcement interactions are public. If you could capture that data, build it into your model, you'd have an even better predictor of suicide risk. They went to their IRB. The IRB said, yes, that data is publicly available. You have to pay for it. It's a company called LexisNexis, you're probably familiar with. They're a large data broker. They have that data set. It's called derogatory data, is how they describe it. IRB said, go ahead and include it. Let's see how this works. But the research team recognized that that was a different context. Now we're bringing this derogatory data into merging it with people's health data to make a judgment about their life and well-being. Maybe we need to think a little bit more about this. So they reached out to me. We've been working for the past year or so on what are the ethics of doing this and what's the right way to integrate that kind of data. So another good example of a research team taking that step to move beyond the regulatory determination and thinking about what else should we be doing to make sure that we're engaging in this new form of data analysis and processing in an ethical way. So that leads us to where do we go from here? In some sense, there's been a big push about going beyond IRBs. And I don't know if that's a good phrase or a bad phrase in this room, but we've had this discussion for a long time. Some of this comes down to the fact that we have more and more people in industry doing research on their users or other users that aren't under any regulatory framework. So how do we help them do things ethically? Think about the Facebook emotional contagion experiment, if you're familiar with that case, that prompted Facebook to essentially build an internal IRB. So there's been this kind of discussion about how do we sort of move beyond, do we create some other group on campus that has a different mandate than just following following the common rule? And do we bring in, I've had conversations with like data librarians or data ethicists like me, like how do we do this? Is this at all feasible? Do we just train the IRBs to expand their mandate beyond just what is required by federal regulations? And there's also been a push to have the research communities themselves engage in more, I guess, self-regulation. Increasingly on conference submissions or journal submissions, the checkbox that did you seek your IRB? Did you go through ethical review? And we just hope that they check it. And does this ever get looked at or audited? Your guess is as good as mine. Some communities are taking a step further. NeurIPS, which is a large, very large conference around image processing, machine learning, computer vision, now requires all submissions to include in the paper a broader impact statement that they have thought about the broader impacts of this research and that they have thought about any ethical implications. Some of this is because their research is about like, how do I identify faces behind N95 masks, which can be important for law enforcement when we're all wearing masks, but could also be used by certain regimes in ways that could be harmful to members of their population. So we want the researchers to be thinking about that at least. But all they got to do is say that they thought about it. The association isn't asking for anything more than that. And at the same time, it's the association themselves that say whether or not that thought is good enough. I sit on the ethics review committee for this conference, and we only see papers if two of the other reviewers say that there's an ethical issue. So it's great that they're doing this, but again, it's a self-regulatory conundrum that we have in many kinds of spaces. But we're moving in a good direction. I think more and more associations are starting to do this kind of work as well. So this is the kinds of things that I spend time thinking about. There are many folks who are really working hard to try to help us work through these conceptual gaps when it comes to the use of big data and research protocols. But this stuff is hard, and it keeps getting more interesting, but more difficult at the same time. But I'm happy to answer any questions you might have or talk more about any of these examples, or even hearing about different kinds of cases that you've maybe seeing that have brought up some interesting challenges. We're continuing this work. We're doing more studies now of different research communities. I'm working on the Qualtrics survey right now. to try to understand how different research communities engage with these issues, to do that kind of comparison. We're probably going to have another study where we're going to talk to IRB members about how they're engaging with these issues as well, all with the hope of building better tools, better educational resources, better city modules, whatever it takes to help us sort of work through these issues in better kinds of ways. So that's the work that we're trying to do in this space, and I really appreciate the time to share this, and happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
So I think all of this is really good and things that we need to think about and things that maybe industry is working towards. OnlyFans, terrible example for this room, but like they did some stuff recently. At what point do you think the public needs to sort of come along? Because I don't think people know how much of their data is being mined from the Facebooks of the world. When you use those filters to see how old you're going to look in 20 years, that's Facebook trying to make sure that their algorithm's right for your Face ID. So at what point do you anticipate outreach beyond an IRB or something along those lines?
That's a great thing to be pointing out. I do think we've had an increase in awareness among the public, I think, in the past few years, mostly due to controversies and bad things that are happening, unfortunately. I think companies are getting a little bit more pressure to do this. I think Apple's a good example, who have decided when they updated, it was iOS 14 a few years ago, to suddenly push out to you to remind you that certain apps are tracking location or certain apps have access to this data. And that was a good example of a company pushing out to the public to create greater awareness of here's what's happening on these devices. And that decision cost Facebook a ton of money because suddenly their advertising platform wasn't as powerful because a lot of people turned off that setting on their iPhone once they were given that nudge and that prompt. So I think it's a good example of how increased consumer awareness can really help. We often have, especially in the policy battles, we have then this dual challenge of increasing consumer awareness, but we still want innovation and business to thrive and these kinds of challenges. And that's why the lobbyists get involved in these kinds of debates. I think the other thing that we need to be careful about is we need to make sure the public is educated and raise awareness, but we also don't want to swing that pendulum so it's solely on the consumer's shoulders to manage their privacy. And we often have that as another challenge where it all becomes, this is, again, I think Facebook's an example where they're very good at giving consumer choice. And you have all controls. You have full control over your platform and how your data is being shared. But that puts an awful lot of burden on you and me and my mother and my little kids on managing all of these settings and all of these apps and all of these platforms. So we got to figure out the right kind of balance there. Yeah. I see a hand here. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for this compelling talk. So I'm wondering about the other side of it, though. There's the world of industry out there that deals with these data sets. And so at Michigan Medicine, for example, we receive requests to share data with biomedical companies, with big data companies. So we've created an internal committee that reviews such data requests. Our CEO has been very concerned about this. But I'm wondering, we're academicians and IRB folks. What do you know about what's going on in the world of industry? And we've got to engage with them, obviously, to make any of this really work in the end.
Absolutely. This is a really complicated challenge. I think it's gotten harder over the last couple of years. We have seen examples of large players in the industry realizing certain duties and responsibilities they have, so they build the kind of committees that you describe. And how do we analyze data sharing practices? At what point does an internal research, if you have any engineering training, you might be familiar with like A/B research, where I'm just testing a change in the interface. Which color blue is going to work better today? And so platforms are constantly testing on their users. But there needs to be some kind of a process in place on when that kind of experimentation moves to something where it could cause a wrong or a harm on a user, or when do we decide when to share data or not to share data? So some industries are doing a better job of building those kinds of internal processes. Sometimes it's because they just have an ethically driven internal process. Sometimes it's because the FTC has made them do this. or they're worried about being caught doing these kinds of things. So the motivations can vary in terms of this. We have yet to build any regulations in the US to force companies to be more active in this space. There's a couple of bills pending right now in Congress that are basically copying the European law in terms of what are companies' internal obligations on how they handle data. But that hasn't come out yet in this space. The other question about sharing of data is another interesting challenge that many in the industry want to make their data available to researchers, some because it helps the public good, some because it can help them improve their own services and processes. That's why they've built APIs, which are interfaces that researchers can use to gather information. TikTok recently even launched a researcher API, so researchers can understand how people are using on TikTok. If you haven't seen a protocol with TikTok data, you will soon. Call me, we'll have to talk about it. But now we're getting a backlash. And part of this is you can see what Musk is doing with Twitter, what Reddit is starting to do as well. They're worried about how their data is being used, and they're pulling back on some of that access. And now it's only people that have privileged access that get the data. And so that becomes a fairness question. So now we suddenly have this challenge about we want companies to be open, we need to protect the subjects, but we don't want to make sure it's only the people that happen to know someone internally. So it gets complicated, but I'd love to talk more about these kinds of issues. I think we have time maybe for one more. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for this. It's been great. Our IRB is navigating a protocol currently where the investigators are taking YouTube videos and analyzing gait with the idea that it can do diagnosis. And our feedback to them was to de-identify the subjects. Can you speak a little to the problems of de-identifying, as we've suggested, particularly visual images?
Yeah, this is a great example of the challenges around de-identification in general. I think we've seen plenty of examples where there is no true anonymity. You can make things difficult to re-identify, but we can't have pure de-identification. So it might be a question of how difficult could it be to re-identify someone. We never know what the variable might be anymore that could identify someone in this room, because it's something to be different than name or age or birthplace or things like that. So this is going to be a big challenge. I think we're going to have to move on. We could talk more about this as well. But the inclusion of visual data and video data, I think, complicates a lot of these issues as well. So great. Thank you.